The sun hung high over Sacramento, California, casting long shadows across Riverfront Park. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, the laughter of children echoed from the playground, and the scent of roasting peanuts drifted from a nearby vendor. It was a beautiful day, the kind that made it easy to forget the weight of the past. But for Robert Bob Whitaker, forgetting was never an option. Bob sat on an old wooden bench, hands clasped, watching the world move around him. He was in his 60s now, retired, and struggling to find a reason to get up in the morning. The military had been his life, his purpose, but when that ended, all that remained were memories, some good, some too painful to bear. A gust of wind rustled the golden leaves overhead. Bob's mind drifted to the past, back to his days in uniform, back to Duke, the German shepherd who had saved his life more times than he could count. He had trusted the system to take care of Duke after retirement. The paperwork had been signed. The assurances had been made. But something never sat right with him. And that was when he saw it. A gaunt, scruffy dog lying at the feet of an elderly man sitting on a bench not far from his own. The dog's matted fur, protruding ribs, and dim amber eyes told a story of suffering, of survival against all odds. Bob's heart slammed against his ribs. His breath hitched. Those eyes. He had seen them before. He stood abruptly, his polished boots crunching against the gravel path. His vision tunneled, the noise of the park faded into the background. He stepped forward, hesitant yet compelled. Duke? The name barely left his lips before the dog's ears twitched. Slowly, painfully, the old dog lifted his head. For a long, agonizing moment, they simply stared at each other. Then, the dog let out a weak whimper, his tail thumping softly against the ground. Bob fell to his knees, his throat tightening. God, he whispered. What happened to you? Before he could reach out, a firm voice interrupted. What do you want with him? Bob looked up. The elderly man, Henry Marshall, gripped the dog's leash, his eyes filled with something between worry and defiance. That's my dog, Bob said, barely recognizing his own voice. The old man shook his head. No, he's mine. I've had him for months. I found him starving in an alley. No one wanted him. I took care of him. Bob swallowed hard, his pulse racing. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a coincidence. This was Duke. But how had he ended up like this? And what would Bob have to do to bring him home? Bob's chest tightened as he stared at Duke, lying there like a shadow of the dog he once knew. The powerful, fearless K-9 he had served with was now frail, weak, and abandoned, a cruel fate he never should have suffered. But now, another man held his leash. Bob's gaze shifted to Henry Marshall, the elderly man gripping the makeshift rope as if his life depended on it. He looked weathered, with deep lines etched into his face, his hands rough from years of hard work. This is my dog, Bob repeated, his voice firmer now. Henry's jaw tightened. No, he's mine. I found him starving, ribs showing, dying in an alley months ago. I nursed him back. Fed him scraps when I barely had enough for myself. Bob's heart pounded. The old man wasn't lying. The guilt twisted deep inside him. He had trusted the system to take care of Duke, and yet, here he was, a broken animal, surviving off the kindness of a stranger. Bob took a breath, fighting the storm of emotions. I understand that you've taken care of him, he said slowly, his voice softer. But you need to understand, he was my partner. He served with me overseas. He saved my life more times than I can count. Henry's knuckles whitened as he gripped the leash tighter. And where were you when he needed saving? Bob flinched. The words hit hard because they were true. The two men stood there, caught in a standoff of unspoken pain. The world moved around them, kids ran past with balloons, couples strolled by holding hands, joggers passed without a second glance, But for Bob and Henry, time had stopped. Duke let out a low whimper, shifting his weight. His once strong body struggled to move, his tail barely wagging. Bob knelt beside him, his throat tight. He reached out, hesitating, waiting for permission, from Duke, from Henry, from fate itself. The dog sniffed the air between them, his nose twitching slightly. Then, for the first time in years, he leaned in. Bob let out a shaky breath, his fingers brushing through Duke's tangled fur, feeling the familiar warmth of the friend he thought he had lost. "He knows me," Bob whispered, his voice raw. Henry's eyes flickered with something between guilt and sorrow. He looked down at Duke, watching the dog press his head against Bob's chest, his tail giving one weak wag. "I didn't steal him," Henry muttered, his voice softer now. "I thought, maybe no one was looking for him." He swallowed hard. No one should have left him like this. Bob's eyes burned. He hadn't left Duke. But the truth was just as painful, he hadn't fought hard enough to keep him, to ensure he was placed in a real home. And Duke had paid the price. "I thought I was giving him a second chance," Henry said, his voice cracking. "But I see now, he already had a home." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then, with trembling hands, Henry loosened his grip on the leash. Bob's heart pounded as Henry sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had finally pressed him down. "If you're telling the truth," Henry murmured, staring at Bob with weary eyes, "then you owe me something." Bob frowned. "What?" Henry nodded at Duke. "You owe it to him to never let him end up like this again." Bob swallowed the lump in his throat. "I won't," he promised. Henry hesitated, then finally let go. Bob's fingers tightened around the leash. Duke was his again. But this wasn't just about reclaiming a lost partner. It was about making things right. Because someone had abandoned Duke, and Bob was going to find out exactly who was responsible. Bob gripped the leash tightly, feeling Duke's weight at his side. The dog barely had the strength to stand, but something flickered in those amber eyes, a glimmer of recognition, a remnant of the warrior he had once been. He had Duke back. But the joy was short-lived. Because as Bob looked down at his old partner, the reality hit him like a freight train. Duke wasn't the same dog he had left behind. The strong, disciplined K-9, the dog that had once stood in the line of fire without hesitation, was now thin, broken, and hesitant. The memories flooded in, uninvited. 6 years ago, Kandahar, Afghanistan. The night was black as ink, the air thick with dust. Bob moved in silence, rifle tight in his grip. Duke padded beside him, his movements fluid, his ears twitching at every sound. This was their fourth mission together, and by now, they were inseparable, two soldiers in perfect sync. Duke had already saved Bob's life once, pulling him back when an enemy combatant had set a tripwire in a bombed-out house. Bob had trusted Duke with his life. And that trust had never been misplaced. That night, the mission was supposed to be simple: clear an abandoned village suspected of hiding insurgents. But nothing was ever simple in war. Bob remembered the explosion first. A flash of fire. A deafening roar. Then pain. He hit the ground hard, his ears ringing, his breath coming in short gasps. He barely had time to process what had happened before bullets started raining down from the rooftops. His squad scrambled for cover, returning fire, shouting commands over the chaos. Bob tried to push himself up, but his leg wouldn't move. Then he saw Duke. The dog was still standing, ears pinned back, eyes darting around, assessing the threat. His flank was bleeding, a deep gash where shrapnel had torn through, but he didn't hesitate. As enemy fire pinned them down, Duke did what no human soldier could. He ran straight into the open, weaving through the gunfire, and latched his powerful jaws onto the nearest enemy's arm. The man screamed, his weapon dropping, and in that instant of distraction, Bob's team fought back. The gunfire stopped. The silence was deafening. Bob forced himself up on one elbow, ignoring the pain in his leg, his eyes scanning for Duke. He found him lying in the dirt, panting heavily. Blood pooled beneath his side, but he was still conscious, still looking at Bob as if waiting for the next command. Bob crawled to him, his hands shaking as he pressed down on the wound. "Stay with me, buddy," he whispered. "I got you." The medics had tried to pull Duke away, insisting that he needed immediate care. But the dog fought against them, straining to stay at Bob's side. It was only when Bob promised, "I'll come back for you, boy. You're not alone," that Duke relented. Back to the present, Sacramento, California. Bob blinked, the memories fading into the present. His breath was unsteady. His hands trembled as he stroked Duke's fur, feeling the scars beneath his fingers, the physical reminders of their past, of the promise Bob had made. A promise he had failed to keep. Duke let out a soft sigh, his body leaning against Bob's knee. He wasn't the same dog from that battlefield. He was older, frilier, forgotten. Bob clenched his jaw. Who had done this to him? "I need answers," Bob muttered under his breath. Henry, who had been watching in silence, finally spoke. "You gonna be okay?" Bob exhaled slowly. "No," he looked down at Duke. "Not until I find out what happened to him." Henry hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Then start where it ended." Bob frowned. "What do you mean?" Henry pointed to Duke's worn-out collar. If he was in the military, someone had to process his discharge. Someone signed the papers that sent him off to wherever he was supposed to go. Bob hadn't thought about it before, but now that he did, rage boiled in his chest. When Duke had retired, Bob had fought to adopt him, but the military had refused, claiming he was being placed in a specialized rehoming program. They had assured Bob that Duke would be safe, taken care of. But that had been a lie. And if Duke had been discarded like trash, how many other retired K-9s had suffered the same fate? Bob stood, the fire in his gut returning. "You're right," he said. "It's time to get some answers." Duke let out a tired but determined whimper, as if agreeing. Henry gave him a small, knowing smile. "Then you better be ready to fight, soldier." Bob looked down at Duke, the dog who had once saved his life. And he made a new promise, one he wouldn't break. This wasn't just about bringing Duke home. This was about justice. And Bob was ready to go to war for it. Bob stood in the quiet of his modest Sacramento apartment, Duke resting at his feet. The old dog's breathing was steady, but the exhaustion in his body was undeniable. Bob ran a hand through his graying hair, his mind racing. Who had abandoned Duke? He thought back to that day 6 years ago when the military had denied his request to adopt Duke. They had assured him that Duke would be placed in a special retirement program, given a good home, and cared for. But they had lied. Now, Duke had been found starving on the streets, left to wither away like an old piece of equipment that had outlived its usefulness. Bob clenched his fists. Someone had to answer for this. Bob pulled out his old military contacts and started making calls. He had spent most of his career in the Marines, but that didn't mean he was powerless now. He still knew people who owed him favors. After a few hours of hitting dead ends, he finally got a lead. A buddy from his unit, now working in military logistics, sent him an email with classified discharge records attached. Bob clicked the file. As he scrolled, his heart pounded in his chest. There it was. Duke's reassignment. He had been transferred to a private contractor for rehabilitation and rehoming. The name of the company made Bob's stomach turn. Guardian Security Solutions. Bob knew that name. He had heard whispers about them before, a shady private defense company, known for hiring out military dogs for security work in foreign territories. They were supposed to give retired K-9s second careers. But that wasn't what had happened to Duke. Bob checked the final entry in Duke's file. It simply read, "Retired due to age and injury. Removed from active roster. Final disposition, not applicable." Not applicable? No further record. No documented transfer. No adoption papers. Nothing. As if Duke had just ceased to exist. Bob exhaled sharply. They hadn't rehomed Duke. They had dumped him. The betrayal burned deep in his chest. Guardian Security Solutions had taken his partner, used him until he was no longer valuable, and discarded him like he was worthless. And if they had done it to Duke, how many other K-9s had they thrown away? Bob refused to let it go. He picked up his phone and dialed the number attached to Guardian Security Solutions' corporate office in Los Angeles. A robotic voice answered. "Thank you for calling Guardian Security Solutions. Please hold for the next available agent." Bob waited, his leg bouncing with impatience. Then, a man's voice came on the line. "Guardian Security. How can I help you?" Bob kept his voice calm, though his blood was boiling. "I'm calling about a retired K-9 that was under your company's care. His name was Duke." A brief silence. Then, the man responded, his tone clipped. "I'm sorry, sir. We don't disclose information about past service dogs." Bob's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm not just anyone. This dog was mine. He was my partner overseas, and I want to know what happened to him." Another pause. Then the man sighed. "Like I said, sir, we don't retain records on retired assets past a certain time frame." Bob's stomach turned at the word assets. Not dogs. Not partners. Assets. Just like gear, weapons, and vehicles, things to be used and discarded when no longer needed. Bob gritted his teeth. "So you're telling me you just, what? Let them loose? Throw them away like trash?" The man's tone shifted, becoming colder. "Sir, if you have concerns, you're welcome to file a formal inquiry through the appropriate channels." Bob could tell he wasn't going to get anywhere over the phone. This wasn't a mistake. This was a system, a broken system that had failed Duke and countless other K-9s. Bob took a deep breath, his fingers tapping against the kitchen counter. Fine. If they weren't going to tell him the truth, he'd find it himself. Bob looked down at Duke, who had dozed off on the floor. The old dog twitched in his sleep, his legs moving as if chasing something in a dream. Bob crouched down, gently running his hand over Duke's matted fur. "I won't let them get away with this," he whispered. Guardian Security Solutions thought they could erase the past. They thought they could get rid of Duke without anyone noticing. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had left behind the one person who would never stop looking for the truth. Bob wasn't finished yet. And by the time he was done, everyone would know exactly what Guardian Security Solutions had done. This wasn't just about Duke anymore. This was about every K-9 who had been abandoned. And Bob was going to make damn sure it never happened again. Bob had spent his life following orders. He had learned patience, discipline, and the ability to read between the lines. But this wasn't war. This was personal. Sitting in his dimly lit apartment, he stared at the computer screen, scrolling through every scrap of information he could find on Guardian Security Solutions. They branded themselves as a premier private defense contractor, specializing in military-trained K-9s for corporate security, law enforcement partnerships, and private security firms overseas. Their website was polished, full of staged photos of well-groomed German shepherds standing beside armed guards. But it was all a lie. Bob had seen what happened to their dogs. He had held the proof in his arms, Duke, once a soldier, now a discarded shell of what he had been. He scrolled through online forums, looking for other handlers who might have experienced the same thing. And that's when he found it. A small, nearly forgotten post buried deep in a military K-9 retirement group. The title sent a chill down his spine. What really happens to our retired K-9s? Bob clicked it. The post was written by a man named Rick Dawson, another retired handler. I was promised my partner would be placed in a good home after his service. But I found out later he never made it to any adoption program. I never got a straight answer about where he went. No paperwork. Just gone. Bob's jaw clenched. Duke wasn't the only one. Bob didn't waste time. He sent a direct message to Rick, explaining what had happened with Duke. It didn't take long for a response. "You're not alone, brother. I've been trying to get answers for years. Meet me tomorrow. I know someone who might help." Bob didn't sleep much that night. He sat on the floor next to Duke's bed, resting his hand on the old dog's back, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breath. "This isn't over," Bob whispered. "Not by a long shot." Meeting an insider. The next day, Bob drove 2 hours to a rundown diner on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Rick Dawson was already there, a burly man in his late 40s with tired eyes and a haunted expression. Beside him sat a woman in her 30s, dressed in business casual but with the tense posture of someone looking over her shoulder. "This is Lisa Harper," Rick introduced. She used to work in Guardian Security's Animal Services division. Bob sat down, his pulse quickening. "And now she's talking?" Lisa exhaled, stirring her coffee. "I left the company a year ago. I couldn't stomach what they were doing anymore." Bob leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Lisa hesitated, then finally spoke. "They don't rehome the dogs," she said quietly. "Not the way they claim. Some of them, the ones they can still profit from, they're sold to private military contractors overseas. Others are used for training purposes. They let new recruits practice restraint techniques on them." Bob felt his stomach turn. "And the ones who are too old or injured?" Lisa hesitated. "They disappear." Bob's hands curled into fists. "You mean they kill them?" Lisa couldn't meet his eyes. "They call it euthanasia, but there's no proper vet care. No records. Just gone." Bob took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay in control. "How do we prove it?" Lisa hesitated. Then she pulled out a small flash drive and slid it across the table. "This has internal emails, financial records, transfer logs. It's not complete, but it's enough to start." Bob picked up the drive, weighing it in his hand. This wasn't just about Duke anymore. This was about hundreds of K-9s, thrown away after giving everything they had. Lisa looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need to be careful. These people, they don't like being exposed." Bob nodded. "I've dealt with worse." Back home, Bob plugged the flash drive into his laptop and opened the files. There it was, proof of everything. Internal memos discussing cost-saving measures by reducing medical care for retired dogs. Documents showing dogs being listed as transferred but with no final destination recorded. Payment logs from third-party companies overseas, confirming Guardian Security was selling K-9s to unknown buyers. Bob knew what he had to do. He didn't just want justice for Duke. He wanted to shut this entire operation down. So he sent an email, not just to one journalist, but to dozens. He attached every file, every document, every record. And in the subject line, he wrote, "The truth about Guardian Security's retired K-9s." Then he hit send. As Bob leaned back in his chair, he glanced down at Duke, who lay on his bed, his tail giving one slow wag. Bob reached out, scratching behind his ears. "We're gonna make this right, buddy." And for the first time in years, Bob felt like a soldier on a mission again. Bob had fought battles before, but this was a different kind of war. No weapons, no combat gear, just the truth, and a relentless determination to bring justice to the forgotten K-9s who had been discarded like yesterday's equipment. The response to his email was immediate. Within hours, investigative journalists from major news outlets began reaching out. Some were skeptical, asking for further proof. Others were horrified by the evidence Bob provided. The story was too big to ignore. Then, the first article was published. Exposed: Guardian Security's treatment of retired military dogs. It hit the internet like a wildfire, shared across social media, veteran groups, and animal rights communities. People were outraged. Former handlers started coming forward, sharing their own horror stories about K-9s they had been forced to leave behind. Family members of fallen soldiers, whose partners had been K-9s, demanded accountability. Even lawmakers took notice. Bob sat in his apartment, watching the chaos unfold on the news. Duke lay beside him, his head resting on Bob's foot, unaware that he had just become the face of a movement. And then the phone rang. Bob picked up, expecting another journalist. Instead, a cold, professional voice greeted him. "Mr. Whitaker, this is Guardian Security's legal team. We strongly suggest you cease your accusations before this becomes a legal matter." Bob smirked. "You mean before it ruins your company? There are consequences for spreading misinformation." Bob's grip on the phone tightened. "You mean there are consequences for getting caught?" A pause. Then, the voice dropped its professional tone. "This is bigger than you, Whitaker. Walk away." Bob hung up. He had spent too many years listening to men like that, powerful people who thought they could silence the truth. Not this time. Not when so many lives had been thrown away in the dark. The pressure on Guardian Security Solutions grew by the day. Animal rights groups called for an investigation. Veteran organizations demanded justice for their fallen K-9 partners. Congressmen started discussing policy changes for K-9 retirements. And then, the protests started. Outside Guardian's Los Angeles headquarters, hundreds gathered, holding signs. "Justice for K-9s. These dogs deserve better. Not forgotten." It was no longer just Bob's fight. The world had seen the truth, and they weren't going to let it go. Then, the real bombshell dropped. A former high-ranking executive from Guardian Security Solutions, a man who had worked on K-9 assignments, came forward as a whistleblower. Live on national television, he admitted it all. The company cut costs by euthanizing useless K-9s. Many were sold to private buyers overseas for security work. Some were simply abandoned, left to fend for themselves. Guardian tried to deny it. But the evidence was too damning. They were finished. Within weeks, the government launched an investigation. Executives resigned, lawsuits were filed, and Guardian collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. But Bob didn't care about corporate scandals. He cared about one thing: Duke, and the hundreds of other K-9s like him who had been tossed aside. One night, as Bob sat on his porch, Duke resting beside him, he received an email. Subject: K-9 Retirement Reform Proposal. It was from a senator, one who had followed Bob's story. "Mr. Whitaker, your efforts have not gone unnoticed. We're working on drafting a new policy ensuring retired K-9s are placed in proper homes. I'd love for you to be involved." Bob stared at the screen, his vision blurring. For the first time in years, he felt like his service wasn't over. There was one last mission left to fight. Bob reached down, scratching behind Duke's ears. "You ready to change the world, buddy?" Duke let out a slow wag of his tail. And Bob knew they had already started. The battle had been fought, and the truth had been exposed, but Bob knew that justice wasn't about headlines or corporate collapses. It was about change. Real, lasting change. And that's exactly what was happening. The public outrage had led to something remarkable. New policies were being drafted to ensure that no K-9 was ever abandoned again. Retired military and police dogs would now be placed in verified homes with handlers who understood their needs. Government funding was being allocated for medical care and rehabilitation. For the first time, these warriors weren't just being thanked for their service. They were being protected. And it had all started with Duke. Bob sat on his porch, watching as Duke stretched in the sunlight. His fur was still patchy in places, and his movements were slower than they once had been, but he was healing. He was home. Duke trotted toward him, his tail giving a slow, steady wag. The sight made Bob smile. For months, he had worried if Duke would ever recover, if the old dog could find himself again after so much neglect. But looking into those amber eyes, Bob saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Peace. "You feeling good today, buddy?" Bob murmured, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. Duke huffed, his tail wagging a little faster. Bob chuckled. "Yeah, I thought so." A week later, Bob and Duke traveled to Washington, D.C. The government had passed a new K-9 Retirement Act, and they wanted Bob to be there for the signing. As he walked through the crowd gathered at the Capitol, veterans and K-9 handlers came forward, shaking his hand, thanking him. But Bob didn't want thanks. He just wanted people to remember. A bronze statue had been unveiled outside the Veterans Memorial, a life-size German Shepherd standing tall, its eyes focused forward, ever watchful. The plaque beneath it read, "For those who served without question, protected without hesitation, and loved without limits, you are not forgotten." Bob ran his hand over the cool metal, his throat tightening. For every Duke, for every K-9 that had been abandoned, this was their justice. This was their legacy. That night, as Bob and Duke sat on their porch back home, Bob looked up at the stars, breathing in the cool California air. This wasn't the life he had expected after retirement. But it was the one he was meant to live. He reached down, ruffling Duke's fur. "We did good, boy." Duke let out a contented sigh, pressing his head against Bob's knee. And for the first time in years, Bob felt whole again. In life, we often speak of loyalty, duty, and sacrifice, but true loyalty isn't just about words. It's about actions. Duke gave everything he had for his country, for his handler, and for the people he protected. And yet, when he was no longer useful, he was discarded, left to suffer alone. How many times do we see this same pattern, not just with animals, but with people? The elderly, the forgotten veterans, the loyal workers who gave their best years to a system that abandoned them when they were no longer needed. This story isn't just about a dog. It's about how we treat those who have served us, and whether we choose to remember their sacrifices or turn away. But Bob made a choice. He didn't turn away. And because of that, justice was served, not just for Duke, but for every forgotten K-9 who had been left behind. We owe a debt of gratitude to those who serve, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. That gratitude isn't just about ceremonies or medals. It's about responsibility. If you know a veteran, check on them. Let them know they're not forgotten. If you see injustice, don't stay silent. Stand up, even when it's not easy. And if you ever have the chance to give a retired K-9 a home, do it. Because their loyalty never wavers, even when the world turns its back on them. The measure of a society isn't in how it treats its strongest, but in how it cares for its most vulnerable, the old, the injured, the ones who have already given all they had. Duke didn't ask for anything but love. And in the end, that's what saved him. May we always remember those who have served. And may we never be the ones who turn away.